Hello everyone, welcome to your next section. Today we're going to be talking all about this thing called for loops. We're not going to learn about data types at all. We're going to teach you about how to do iteration and automate processes in Python using lists, dictionaries, and strings. For loops are one of the most powerful things you'll learn. They exist in every language because it's so useful to be able to run the same process on multiple items or variables all at once, and Python's really quick at doing this. This is also where you're going to start to see a lot more indentation in Python. So Python is an indented language, unlike JavaScript, which uses a lot of different braces and stuff, and indents don't matter. Rather, in Python, indents do have a lot of meaning, and they force you to look at your code in a very specific way. So you're going to deal with more indentation and the syntax of for loops and how iteration works. So today, you're going to learn what the for loop is. We're going to learn essentially about looping in general, but we're going to talk about kind of the simpler of the two types of loops that you use in Python. Next class is going to be on a concept called while loops. But in for loops, I'm going to teach you how the iteration process works. We're going to take it one step at a time, where where we're going to look at a for loop and do the whole entire process manually by hand, one step at a time, so you understand how it's working. And then I'll show you how for loops operate with three data types that we're familiar with: strings, lists, and dictionaries. Okay, so what is a for loop as a definition? It's essentially a method to iterate across something that has a bunch of information. In our case, we know about methods that can iterate. The data types that we know how to iterate across at the moment are with dictionaries, lists, and strings. However, there are other types of objects that you can iterate across. For instance, an example would be like a pandas data frame, so like a file of data. You can use a couple of commands in order to essentially convert a data frame into a list that you can iterate across. So for loops are extremely powerful, and we're going to talk about how we iterate and what iteration looks like with these three data types. So with that in mind, guys, I'm going to teach you the syntax of a for loop, starting with a simple example with lists, and then add on top of that iteration process with two other examples of for loops. So let's just jump into the syntax and draw this out a little bit. So the first thing we see here is that I'm creating a list variable. I'm calling it new list in this case because it's not your first list anymore, it's just a new one. And we are going to assign some values to our list. We know this is a list because there's square braces, and we have 4 values, all integers in our list. You'll notice here we have a negative number, which is, inconsequential, but just showing you that you can indeed have negative numbers in your integers in a list. So the next line is the syntax to create a for loop, and it's quite simple. So the first thing you'll notice is we write for, and then we need to label what the variable name is going to be for our iteration process, meaning we name this anything. I'm calling this at the moment element, because it makes sense for the type of information that we're going to iterate across in our list. You can use this variable or iterable variable name. You can name it virtually anything. However, it's usually good practice to name whatever the variables are inside this list. We don't exactly know what they are. Let's say this is like height information or age. I don't know how you can be -3, but proper practice would be to label each of the iterables what they actually are or represent, so it's easier for other people to understand. Anyway, let's continue with this syntax. So we say basically how this is reading in English is for every element or for each element in this list item or this list object. So that means we want to go through every element of this list one at a time, and every time, and then we finish our syntax with a colon, just like we did with if statements, for instance. So when our for statement is complete, we make sure that it finishes off with a colon, and that everything that we want to run within this iteration, within this for loop, needs to be indented. And we know that there's an indentation there because we see the signal with this colon at the end. So everything that you include that is indented in this for loop will run on this list, okay? So you can have hundreds of thousands of lines all indented, and it'll run that process for just this list. Okay? And so how this will end up working is if we're printing this, what is first going to happen is it starts with our first element at 1, and then it prints 1 plus 2, which is 3. And now that this iteration is over, it's now going to move into our next element, our next iteration in the for loop, which is 5. And then what we see that it needs to do with 5 is that we want it to print 5 plus 2, 7. Next, it's going to go to -3, so we'll have -1, and then we'll have 14 plus 14. Do that there. Okay, so that is how the iteration process works in Python for lists. Okay, it's going to run through each of these elements in a for loop and return whatever response it needs to do. Okay, if you didn't have element here and just said +2, it's just going to print 2 4 times, because even though it's on this element at first, we're not doing anything with it. So it'll just print 2, then go to 5, and then 2, go to -3, 2, and so on. Okay, hope that makes sense. Next, what does iteration look like when we iterate across a string? Oh, there's a little bit of an issue here. We're going to put new string, not new list. New string. And that will run. So we have our string hello, and the syntax for our for loop, remember, is for each element in our variable. In this case, we have a string, so I'm going to label this as for every character, because how iteration and for loops work for strings is that it will go to each character in position and then run some sort of iterative process. Okay, so technically, when we're running a for loop on a string, each element of that for loop is going to be a character. So this is why it makes sense to label our variables things that make sense. It's not great to put like for x in a new string, because no one's going to know what x is except for you, and you might even forget. So always good to label your variables properly. And in this case, what's going to happen is that it's going to print h, then e, and then all the way down. One thing about printing in Python with iterables is that because you're printing, every new print is ends with a line break. That's not the right one. Ends with a line break. So every iteration, you know what's going on in every iteration, because this print is going to put the new iteration on a new line. So what we'd expect from this for loop with new string is that it's going to print each character one at a time, or do a process on each character one at a time. Lastly, we have a dictionary here that I've established. And how do dictionaries work with for loops? So when you do a for loop with a dictionary, so for whatever variable name in the dictionary, what you're extracting is you're going to be extracting each key. So the variable here in the for loop with a dictionary is for each key in the dictionary, do something with the key. So at this point, you can't do much with what I have printed here. All that's going to print is each of these keys. There's no values associated with it. When we get into our Python, our terminal, and do this from console, you're going to see how we can access the key and the value. But I kind of wanted to just show you how each of these for loops work, what they extract for these data types, and how to deal with the syntax. Okay, so remember the syntax is for whatever the variable name you assign it is. In this case, it's going to be a key in this dictionary. So for variable iterable name in whatever object you're iterating across, and you close that with a colon, do something with it. And remember that after that colon, if we want to run multiple processes on whatever this variable is, we have to keep everything indented. And once we get back to like this line here where it's unindented, that for loop now ends. Okay, let's hop into terminal and see how this is all shaping out. Okay, so here we are in Python. The first thing I'm going to do is create our new list so we can play with for loops. So we'll do 1, 3, -2, 20, 12 again. Okay. And so for our for loop, let's iterate across that and see what we got going on here. Let's see if we just do help for and see what happens. Yeah, it's not going to understand what that is. So I was just curious if that would work. So in new list, we're going to go for number, let's just say. I said element the first time in new list, print number plus 2. Now remember that when I indent, or when I had an if statement and it was expecting more information after the if statement to run a process, like after this colon here, the chevrons turn to ... which means it's waiting for more information before it runs an execution. So it knows that I've successfully did the syntax for this for loop and is saying, okay, what do I need to do with this for loop? And I'm saying, hey, print the number, but add 2 to it. And now because I hit enter here, I could still ask it for more information or to do something else. It stays ... but because we're finishing up here, I want to just enter one more time. I'm basically removing indentation from my Python line, and we'll see what happens. With that indentation removed, it should run the for loop. And indeed it does. And it prints each element plus 2 onto our console here, as you can see. Okay, so that's what we'd expect from the syntax. Now here's a little trick you can do with lists as well. So let's say you don't want it to iterate across everything in the list. So what you can do is use your indexing on this list. Remember, if you index a list and you have multiple values, it's going to return as a list itself. So this is kind of like a sub list. And if we run this now, it's only going to give us the first 3 elements, right? 0, 1, 2, up to 3. So that's a little trick you can use with lists that you can like integrate some of the things we've learned about indexing into lists. And this will also work for strings and can work for dictionaries if you do it slightly differently. Let's try our string now. New string equals hello. And if we do for character in new string, let's just print character. And also give it an exclamation point and see what happens. So there we go. It runs through each character, and because we're printing the character as well as an exclamation point, it's printing both, as you see there. So remember, with for loops and characters, it's going to iterate across every character, or with strings, it's going to iterate across every character. Lastly, we're going to go to dictionaries now. So let me create a dictionary, and you'll see how this works. 32, name, Mike. Remember how we build our dictionaries? Rather than having a position, we have key-value pairs. Age is the key, 32 is the value, and it's separated by, delineated by a comma. And we know that the key has been initialized because we have a colon here. So we say this is the key, this is the value for that key. Press enter, that exists. So remember that when we do a for loop with a dictionary, that something else happens. So we remember our syntax. So for the variable name or iterable name in whatever we're iterating across. For a list, it's giving you each element of the list. For a string, it's giving you each character in the string. And for a dictionary, it's going to run through each key in the dictionary. So if we just print the key here, what are we going to get? We're going to get just the keys, age and name. However, if we wanted to maybe, let's say, access the value for that dictionary, we don't want the keys, we want the numbers or the information related to the keys. How would we do that in our for loop? It's pretty simple. We have the key here, but remember, how do we call and index a specific value in a dictionary? First, we call a dictionary, we give it the square braces, and usually we'd manually put in each variable here. But remember, since each variable is assigned to, is an iterable called the key, and we've seen that printed here as a string, we can just put the key in here, and that should provide the value. So we should be seeing age, and then because we're going new dictionary, square brackets, the key, which will be age or name as we iterate across, this should provide us the value for that. Let's print that out and see. In fact, it does. So even though you're only getting the key in a for loop with a dictionary, you're actually getting both by default, okay? And that's important because you might want both, and this is a much simpler way of extracting that information rather than like going, okay, let's get our key list, which is new dictionary.keys, and then, for the key in key list, print the key, and you get the same thing there. And it's a little bit messy. Excuse me, it's a little bit messier, and it doesn't quite work in certain cases. So this is much more succinct. All right. So guys, with that in mind, I think we have introduced for loops enough for today. Let's do a recap. What you learned today is how for loops work, how the iteration of for loops exists, and specifically for each data type. You learned what iteration is and how iteration is functioning within for loops. The next section we're going to deal with is in while loops and how that whole structure works. It's a little bit different than for loops in that I'd say they're more complicated. You actually include logic in your while loops rather than saying, okay, it's going to iterate across everything up within an object. You're saying iterate until some condition now is rendered false or something. So with that in mind, guys, thank you very much for listening to this lecture, and I'll catch you in the next one.